That wood is community property now, and frankly, you should thank us for hauling it off your eyesore of a porch. That was Diane Whitlock, president of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association for 9 years running. Standing on my gravel drive at 7 in the morning, while 2 men she had hired loaded 4 cords of my split firewood into a flatbed trailer. The wood I had cut, hauled, and seasoned. Myself across a long autumn, the wood that was going to carry my granddaughter and me through a mountain winter that had already started spitting snow off the ridge. I am Russell Hale. I am 62 years old. For 31 years, I worked as a sawmill operator and a timber cruiser for a regional lumber outfit up here in the high country, which means I have spent most of my life measuring standing timber, marking cut lines, and knowing exactly where one man's trees end and another man's begin. I own 11 acres at the end of Cedar Ridge Road, a log house my late wife Carol and I raised our daughter in. And I keep my records the way I was trained to keep them, which is to say, obsessively. What Diane did not know that cold morning, what she never once bothered to check in the 2 years she spent trying to bring my land to heel, was that the forest her precious development bought its discounted lumber from, the 300-acre tract that fed the lumberyard supplying every model home and every contractor she sent my way, had a deed history I happen to know. Better than anyone alive, I'd cruised that timber for the company that used to own it. I knew its corners, I knew what was wrong with the line. So let me ask you something before I tell you the rest. If a woman in pearls in a golf cart stole the firewood off your porch and told you to thank her for it, and you happened to be the one man in the county who knew the ground under her whole operation better than she did, what would you have done? Would you have shouted? Would you have called a lawyer and waited 18 months? Or would you have gone quiet, gone careful, and started reading old paper? I went quiet. Let me tell you how it started. Carol and I bought the 11 acres in 1988, back when Cedar Ridge Road was a logging spur with 2 cabins on it, and the nearest pavement was 4 miles down the mountain. We paid for it over 12 years, a little every month, scraping. The first winter we lived in a borrowed travel trailer, parked on the build site, while I notched the foundation logs by hand. And Carol kept a coffee can on the trailer counter that we fed every spare dollar into, and she wrote LAND on the side of it in black marker. I still have that can. It is on a shelf in my shop with screws in it. Now, we cleared the house site on weekends, the 2 of us, dragging slash into burn piles while the snow came down sideways off the ridge. I cut the trees for the walls off our own ground, peeled them with a draw knife in the spring, and let them cure a year before I ever laid the first course. A log house is a thing you build out of the land it stands on, and that fact mattered to me long before Diane Whitlock ever taught me how much. Our daughter learned to ride a bike on the only flat patch of dirt we had, going in circles past the burn piles while we worked. Carol planted lilacs along the south wall. The second spring, 4 little sticks she bought at a feed store down the valley, and they are taller than the eaves now. And they still bloom every May, 8 years after we lost her. The land was never an investment to us. We never once talked about what it might be worth. It was the thing we made, together, with our own hands. And when she got sick, near the end, she took my hand in that hospital bed, and she did not ask me to do anything dramatic. She asked me to keep the place. She said, "Keep it exactly as ours, Russ. Do not let anybody change it into something else." I told her I would. A man keeps a promise like that the only way he can, which is by being too stubborn and too careful to lose. For most of those years, there was no homeowners association at all. Then, a developer named Garrett Whitlock bought up the old Pearson Ranch on the bench above us, subdivided it into 90 lots, called it Cedar Ridge Estates, and his wife, Diane. My 11 acres were not part of his subdivision. My deed predated his plat by more than 30 years. None of that mattered to Diane, who had decided, somewhere in the comfortable certainty of her own mind, that anything she could see from her back deck fell under what she liked to call the aesthetic envelope of the community. Orte. The first letter came on a Tuesday in the spring of that first year. It was printed on cream cardstock with a little embossed pine tree, and it informed me that my woodpile, which I stacked along my own fence line 140 feet from the nearest estates lot, was in violation of community standards regarding visible outdoor storage. There was a fine attached, $75. I did not live in her community. I owned no lot in her association. I had signed nothing. I drove up the next morning, parked outside the little stone gatehouse they used as an office, and tried to do the neighborly thing. I brought the deed in its plastic sleeve. I brought the recorded plat. I brought the county tax map with my parcel outlined in highlighter so a child could read it. I laid all three on the counter, and I kept my voice as level as I keep it, and I said that my land was not part of Cedar Ridge Estates, that it never had been, that my deed predated the whole subdivision by more than 30 years, and that I would be glad to walk the boundary with her any morning she liked, and show her exactly where the line ran on the ground. Diane Whitlock did not pick up the deed. She looked at it on the counter the way you might look at a coupon that had expired, with a small, patient, pitying expression, and she let me finish. And then she slid the deed back across the counter toward me with one manicured finger, never quite touching it with her hand. "Mr. Hale," she said, "you may hold a piece of paper, but you live inside our viewshed, and that makes you functionally part of our jurisdiction. We can do this the easy way or the expensive way. I would so hate for it to be the expensive way." There was a young woman behind her at a desk, the association's secretary, and I watched the young woman look down at her keyboard, not at me, and I understood that this was a room where my deed did not count for anything, because the people in it had decided in advance that it would not. That was the first time I heard the word jurisdiction come out of Diane's mouth. It was not the last. I took my deed back, folded it into the manila folder I had brought it in, and on the drive home I labeled that folder in my head the way I labeled everything from my cruising days. Cedar Ridge, Diane W., Incident 1. I started a legal pad that night. Date, time, what was said, what was done. I had a habit older than my marriage, and that habit was about to do the heaviest work of my life. The fines came in a stack after that. They came whether I responded or not, and I learned quickly that responding only fed her, because a reply was something she could file as engagement, as proof that I acknowledged her authority. So, I stopped replying. By the end of that first summer, she had assessed me 11 separate violations. Improper fencing on a split-rail fence that had stood since the Reagan administration. Unapproved exterior paint on a log house that has never worn a drop of paint in its life, and never will. An unsightly vehicle, which was my 20-year-old work truck, parked in my own yard, on my own gravel. Excessive outdoor storage, which was my woodpile. Failure to maintain community aesthetic standards, which meant nothing at all and could mean anything she wanted. Each one carried a fine, $75, $100, $150, climbing as she went. Each one she mailed to my house in a cream envelope with a little embossed pine tree, and each one, I learned later, she photocopied and slid into a file at the association office, building what she imagined in her head was a case against me. 11 violations that first summer. 0 of them on property she had 1 inch of authority over. I filed every single one in the manila folder in order, by date, and I wrote the matching entry in the legal pad, and I took a photograph of each notice on the gate before I touched it with the date stamp turned on, the way Megan later taught me to do it, better than I did it myself. People ask me why I did not just sue her that first year, and the honest answer is that I had cruised enough timber sales and watched enough men go to the courthouse to know that the man who runs to the law first usually runs to it loudest and leaves it poorest. Paper wins slow. A deed does not raise its voice. I wanted the record clean, and I wanted, when the day finally came, to be able to lay down 2 full years of her conduct, and not one hot word of my own beside it. So I let her build her stack, and I built mine, and I waited to understand what she actually wanted from an old man at the bottom of the road. Because by the end of that first summer, I had started to suspect, the way you suspect weather coming, that this was never about a woodpile at all. It was Megan who first said the thing out loud. She came to live with me when she was 13 after her mother, my daughter, went through a hard stretch that is hers to tell and not mine, and the two of us learned how to keep a house together, one quiet supper at a time. By the second year of all this, she was 15, sharp as a tack, better with a phone than I will ever be, and she had taken over the documentation without my ever asking her to. She photographed every notice Diane left on our gate, with the date stamp turned on, named the files, backed them up to a second drive in the desk, and scolded me when I touched a notice before she had shot it. One evening, she was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling back through 2 years of those pictures, and I was at the stove, and she went still, and then she said, "Grandpa, look at this." I came over. She had them sorted by location. "She only fines you for stuff she can see from the new houses on the bench," Megan said. "The woodpile, the truck, the aspens she keeps writing up. It's all on the view side. The back of your property, the stuff nobody up there can see. She's never once fined you for any of it. She's not enforcing rules. She's clearing the view." I looked at the lilacs through the dark window and past them up the slope, at the rows of half-built model homes on the bench and the little wire for sale flags snapping on their stakes. And I understood that my granddaughter, at 15, with a phone and a quiet eye, had seen the true shape of it before I had. Diane was not enforcing anything. She was improving a product. Every cord of wood, every old work truck, every honest working detail of an 11-acre homestead sitting at the bottom of her buyer's view was a thing that knocked a few $1,000s off the asking price of the lots above it. Her husband was selling those lots. She was staging the set. The fines were never meant to be paid. They were meant to make me leave, or at least to make me tidy myself out of the frame. That was the night the temperature of the whole thing changed for me. Not hotter, colder, more careful. I put my hand on the back of Megan's chair, and I told her she had just done a better cruise of that woman than I could have, and she grinned at me. And I went back to the stove and started quietly to think about the ridge. The second year is when the staircase steepened. In April, she sent a man in a reflective vest and a hard hat to my property line with a clipboard, and he announced he was conducting a compliance inspection on behalf of the county. He had a lanyard around his neck with a laminated card on it, and he held the clipboard against his chest like a shield. I came down off my porch with my coffee and I looked at the card. It said nothing official on it. It was a parking pass for a job site. "Whose county office do you work out of?" I asked him. He named no office. "What's your inspector number?" I asked him. He had no number. I asked him for any county credential at all, and he could not produce one because there was none to produce. He was a contractor named Eddie, who Garrett Whitlock used to frame houses, dressed up that morning to look like authority. And when I told him level and quiet, that he was standing on private land outside any jurisdiction he had ever held, and that I was a retired man with nothing to do all day but document people who lie to my face. Eddie folded up his clipboard, got back in his truck, and left without another word. Fake inspector. I had lost exact count of the incidents in my head by then. The legal pad had not lost count. 22 entries. In June, she went after the man who delivered my heating oil. His name was Sal. He had filled my tank for 15 years, and one cold week he called me from the bottom of the road, embarrassed, and said the HOA lady had flagged him down at the estate's entrance and told him the road past the gate was a private community road and he would be trespassing if he drove up to service me. It is not a private road. It is County Road 11. Maintained with county money, plowed by a county truck, and I hold a recorded easement of access across it that is older than Diane's marriage. Sal did not know that, and his dispatcher did not want the trouble. And for 3 weeks in the middle of a hard cold snap, the oil company would not send a truck up the mountain to me. I drove down to their office in town with the recorded easement and the county road designation, both of them on paper, both of them stamped, and I laid them on the dispatcher's desk and waited while he read them twice. He apologized. He sent a truck that afternoon. By then Megan and I had run the wood stove around the clock for those 3 weeks to keep the pipes from freezing, which was exactly the kind of detail Diane never thought about, that the woman finding me for my wood pile had nearly forced me to lean on that very wood pile to keep a 15-year-old warm. Harassed customers. The pad grew. I dated it, and I filed it. In August, a deputy named Tom Brandt rolled up my drive on a complaint that I was running an illegal commercial operation, which was Diane's description of the fact that I sometimes split and sold a few cords of firewood to neighbors in the fall, the way half the mountain does. Tom is a steady man, near my age, and he stood in my yard with his thumbs in his belt and looked genuinely sorry to be there. "Russ," he said, "you and I both know this is nothing. But somebody filed it, so I have to roll on it and I have to write it up. That's how it works. A complaint gets made, we respond, whether it's air or not." I told him I understood. Then I asked him a question I had been turning over for a while. I asked what it would take, if a person were being harassed by an organized campaign of false complaints, to actually do something about it. Tom thought about it. "Pattern," he said. "One complaint is one complaint, but if you can show me a documented pattern, dated, consistent with the same source behind it, that stops being a neighbor dispute and starts being something a prosecutor will look at, you'd want a stack. Real records." Not he said. I had real records. I had been keeping them for 2 years. I thanked him all the same, and I did not show him the folder yet, because the folder was not done. I had one more thing I wanted to confirm first, and it had nothing to do with my 11 acres. It had to do with the 300 acres on the far side of the ridge. Here is the piece Diane never knew to look for. Cedar Ridge Estates did not buy its lumber retail. Garrett Whitlock had cut a sweetheart supply deal with the lumberyard down in the valley, and that lumberyard sourced its logs from a single private tract, the old Hammond timber parcel, 300 acres of mixed conifer that ran along the back of the ridge. Cheap logs, cheap dimensional lumber, cheap model homes, fat margins. That tract was the quiet engine under his whole subdivision. And I knew that tract. I had personally cruised it in 1996 for the company that owned it before the Hammonds. I had walked every corner of it, and there was something about its eastern boundary that had bothered me for 30 years. When I cruised that line back in '96, the recorded survey put the eastern property corner at a particular bend in a creek. The timber company, though, been cutting and selling, and the lumberyard had been hauling, as though the boundary ran along a fence 200 feet further east, taking in a long finger of old growth that the actual deed never included. 200 feet across the better part of a mile is a lot of standing timber. It was an honest enough drift in the beginning, the kind of slow encroachment that happens when nobody walks the real line for decades. What it meant was that the cheap logs feeding Garrett Whitlock's lumberyard, and therefore his subdivision, were partly coming off ground the seller did not actually own. I sat on that knowledge for a long time. It was not mine to use, and a man does not go poking at another man's boundary line without a reason. That winter, though, with Diane stealing the wood off my porch and clearing the view for her husband's lots, I decided to do something a careful man can always do, which costs nothing and asks no one's permission. I went to the county recorder's office, and I started reading old paper. I knew that office well from my cruising years. The clerk on the counter was a patient woman named Brenda, who had pulled records for me on a dozen timber sales over the decades, and when I told her what I wanted, she did not blink. Recorded deeds, survey plats, tax maps, going back 90 years, the chain of title on the Hammond tract, all the way back to the original patent. She brought me the big bound books and the microfilm and a cup of bad coffee, and I sat at a scarred oak table in that quiet room for the better part of 3 days, working backward through the grantor and grantee indexes the way I once worked backward through stump counts, one entry at a time, dating each step in my pad. And the chain told a story, the way an honest chain of title always does if you are patient enough to read every link. The original Hammond parcel, the real one, the deeded one, had been sold off in pieces over the years, and that disputed eastern finger, the 200-foot strip of old growth the lumberyard had been quietly cutting. It belonged, on paper, recorded and unbroken since 1941, to a separate 40-acre parcel that had passed down through a family named Coyle, who had moved off the mountain 2 generations back and stopped walking their ground. That 40 acres, including the strip, was sitting in a quiet estate, the taxes barely current, nobody watching it, nobody walking it, the recorded line waiting in a book for someone to come and read it. I am a timberman. I know what a 40-acre parcel of old-growth conifer is worth standing, and I know what it is worth to the people who have been illegally cutting it. So that spring, I did the quietest, most ordinary thing in the world. I tracked down the Coyle heirs, 3 cousins scattered across 2 states who had genuinely forgotten they owned mountain ground, and I called them one at a time and made them a fair cash offer for the whole 40 acres. I did not lowball them. A man who steals the bottom dollar off an old family is no better than the woman stealing wood off my porch, and besides, I wanted this deed to be clean enough to hold up in any room in the county. I told the cousins the truth, as much of it as was theirs to hear. I said I was a retired timber cruiser who had walked their ground 30 years ago, that I liked the parcel, and that I wanted to keep it from being logged. The oldest cousin, a man about my age, was quiet on the phone for a moment, and then said his grandfather used to take him up there as a boy, and he was glad it would go to somebody who knew what it was. They were glad to be rid of the tax bill. We closed in May, through a title company down in the valley, every signature notarized, every link in the chain checked. I recorded the deed at the county on a Thursday morning, Brenda stamping it at the same counter where I had read the old books, and I drove home the legal owner of the exact strip of forest that Garrett Whitlock's lumberyard had been stealing logs from for 15 years. I did not tell a soul. Not Tom Brandt, not Pete Salas, not even Megan. Not at first, though it near killed me to keep it from her after everything she had carried. I put the recorded deed in the manila folder, in the front, ahead of the 2 years of Diane's violations. And I closed the folder, and I set it on the shelf next to Carol's coffee can. And I waited. I did not have to wait long because Diane was not a patient woman. And patient is the only thing that beats her kind. That September, she made her final climb up the staircase, and it was the step that crossed the line clean. She sent a crew, not an inspector this time, not a letter on cream cardstock. 3 men with a chainsaw and a chipper, hired and paid by the association, who showed up at my gate on a Saturday morning, while Megan and I were down in town buying her school supplies. They cut down the row of mature aspens along my drive, the ones that screened my house from the bench, 11 trees I had nursed for 15 years, and they fed them into the chipper, one after another. And they did it on my land, without permission, without a permit, without any authority on God's earth. A neighbor, 2 parcels over, an older rancher named Pete Salas, who had had his own long troubles with Diane over a fence line, saw the trucks turn up my drive and knew it was wrong, and he walked down to his own fence with his phone and started filming. He got all of it. The crew, the chainsaws screaming, the chipper blowing my trees out in a brown arc. And he got Diane Whitlock herself, standing in the road in a magenta blazer with her sunglasses pushed up on her head, directing the men with one pointed finger, saying to the air she did not know was being recorded, "We are simply restoring the sightline this community is entitled to. He has no standing to stop us, none." Megan and I came home to stumps. 11 raw white stumps and a driveway full of wood chips where her great-grandmother's view of the valley used to be screened by trees her grandfather planted. My granddaughter, 15 years old, got out of the truck with a bag of notebooks in her hand, and she stood in the gravel and she looked at the stumps for a long time, and she did not cry. She set the bag down on the tailgate. Then she turned to me, and her jaw was set the way Carol's used to set, and she said 4 words. "Now, will you use the folder?" I called Tom Brandt that afternoon. I told him I had the pattern he had asked me about a year before, dated and documented across 2 years, and that I now had a recorded act of criminal trespass and destruction of property, captured on video, with the responsible party identifying herself on the recording in her own voice. Tom came out that evening, after his shift, still in uniform, and he sat down at my kitchen table under the light over the table where Carol used to roll out pie crust, and I set the legal pad and the folder in front of him and poured him a cup of coffee, and he went through it. He went through it page by page. He did not rush. He read every dated entry, 2 years of them, and he laid the violation notices out in rows, and he watched Pete's video twice, the second time with the sound up. When he was done, he sat back, and he was quiet for a moment, rubbing his jaw, and then he looked up at me. "Russ," he said, "how long have you had all this?" 2 years, I said. I kept it the way I was taught to keep an after-action file. Date, time, what was said, what was done, whether anything ever came of it or not. He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief at me, but at the size of what was sitting on my kitchen table. He took copies of all of it. He told me the destruction of the aspens alone, with Pete's video and Diane naming herself on it, was enough on its own to refer to the district attorney, and that the documented 2-year pattern behind it turned a single Saturday's vandalism into something with the word organized in front of it. I told him there was one more piece, all the same, and that it was the piece that actually mattered, and that I wanted to deliver it myself, in the right room, in front of the right people, where it would do the most good and could never be walked back. The right room turned out to be the County Planning Commission, 3 weeks later at the public hearing where Garrett Whitlock was seeking approval for the second phase of Cedar Ridge Estates, the 40 new lots on the upper bench that depended entirely on the cheap lumber flowing up from the Valley Yard. It was a public meeting, posted and open, and anyone who lived in the county could stand and speak for 3 minutes. The room was full that night, folding chairs in rows, the commission seated at a long table up front with a document camera and a screen on the wall behind them. Diane sat in the front row beside her husband in a hot pink blazer, ankles crossed, a leather folio in her lap, the very picture of a woman who had never once in her life seriously imagined losing anything. I am not a man who speaks at meetings. I had never held a microphone in my life, and my hands were not as steady as I would have liked walking up there. When they called for public comment, though, I stood, and I walked to the little podium, and I did not say one word about my firewood, or the 41 fines or the aspens, or the 2 cold years. None of that belonged in that room. I said only that I was a retired timber cruiser, that I had cruised timber in this county for 31 years, and that I had a serious concern about the lumber supply underpinning the project before the commission that night. Then I unfolded the recorded survey plat from 1941, and beside it the cruise map I had drawn of the Hammond Tract, with my own hand in 1996, and I laid them both on the document camera so the whole room could see them up on the screen. I explained plainly that the logs feeding this development came off the valley yard, that the valley yard sourced from the tract behind the ridge, and that for 15 years that tract had been cutting 200 feet over its recorded eastern line into a separate deeded 40-acre parcel of old growth that did not belong to it. I said the cutting was, in plain terms, timber theft, a felony in this state, and then I said the last thing, the quiet thing, the thing I had carried into that room, folded in the front of my folder. I know the line is real, I said, because in May I bought that 40 acres. I am the recorded owner of the ground they have been stealing from. Here is the deed. I laid the recorded deed on the camera. The room did not erupt. That is not how it goes, no matter what you have seen. It went silent. The county surveyor, a woman named Linda Ortiz, who sat at the commission table, leaned forward and looked at the 41 plat, and at my cruise map, and at the recorded deed. And she put on her glasses, and she traced the same line I had traced, and the silence stretched out long enough that I could hear the air handler in the ceiling. Then she took off her glasses, and she said to the chair, "Not to me," in the flat voice of a professional who has just seen something land. "The boundary he's describing is consistent with a recorded survey. If the cutting went where he says it went, this is outside our planning question. This is a referral." That was the whole reveal. No shouting. A finger on a line, a deed on a screen, and a neutral professional saying the word referral into a microphone. I looked over at Diane Whitlock one time. She had gone the color of paper. She finally understood, 2 years too late, the difference between a view shed and a deed. Here are the 2 numbers I want you to hold next to each other, because they are the whole story. In 2 years, Diane Whitlock assessed me 41 separate fines for a total, she claimed, of just over $9,000. She collected from me exactly 0. Not 1 cent. Every fine sat unpaid and unenforceable, because she had no authority over my land. And every one of them, dated and filed, became evidence of the pattern. 41 fines, $0 collected, against a deed that had been recorded since 1941, and a boundary line that had been true the entire time. What happened after was not my doing. It was the automatic consequence of facts meeting authority, which is the only kind of justice I trust. The district attorney took Tom's referral on the aspens and the 2-year pattern and charged Diane with criminal trespass and felony, destruction of property, and the organized record turned a single Saturday's vandalism into a far heavier thing than she had ever imagined a woodpile dispute could become. Pete Salas swore an affidavit. Sal, the oil man, swore another. The young secretary who had looked down at her keyboard the day I brought my deed to the gatehouse turned out to have kept her own quiet notes, and she handed them over, because there is usually one person in a room like that who never liked what they were watching. The State Forestry Division took the timber theft referral and did the thing nobody had done in 15 years. They walked the eastern line of my new 40 acres against the recorded survey, corner to corner, with the 41 plat in hand, and they confirmed every foot of it. 15 years of cutting 200 feet over the boundary onto deeded ground that was now mine. That investigation reached the Valley Lumberyard and the lumberyard's cheap supply, and from the supply it reached Garrett Whitlock's sweetheart deal and the fat margins underneath his whole subdivision. Phase 2 did not get approved. It was not voted down in anger. It simply could not move because the cheap lumber pipeline that made Cedar Ridge Estates pencil out on paper was now the subject of a felony timber theft investigation. And the bank financing the upper bench got nervous the way banks always do the moment a number stops being clean. The 40 new lots that Diane had been clearing my view to sell went still over that winter. And then quietly, the way these things die, they went away. The little wire for Sal flags came down off the bench one muddy spring and did not go back up. She tried to take the sight line this community was entitled to. She lost the development the sight line was for. The flood she aimed at me fell on her own bench. I never had to lift a hand or raise my voice. The deed did it. The recorded line did it. The 2 years of dated paper in a manila folder did it, exactly the way I always knew. It would if I just kept it long enough, and kept it clean. The aspens, I want to tell you, are coming back. I planted 30 new ones along the drive that next spring. Little whips no taller than Megan's waist, and she helped me set every one of them, tamping the dirt with the heel of her boot the way she had seen me do it. They will screen the house again before she has children of her own, the firewood that started the whole thing. The 4 cords Diane hauled off my porch, that first cold morning, I never got back, and I never once asked for it. It was not worth asking for. I cut 6 more cords that fall off my own dead-standing timber, bucked and split and stacked by hand the way I have done every autumn of my life. And I stacked it along the same fence line, in the same spot, in the exact place she had fined me for it more than once. And I let it stand there all winter, where anyone on the bench who cared to look could see it plain. Nobody sent a letter. There was nobody left up there to send one. Megan graduated this past June. She wants to study forestry. She told me she wants to learn to read the land the way I read it, the corners and the lines and the old paper underneath all of it. And when she said it, we were standing in the driveway, in the shade of the new aspens. And I thought about Carol's promise, and I thought, the place is still ours, and it is still exactly as ours, and now it always will be. So here is the lesson, plain, because you came this far, and you have earned it. If somebody with a clipboard tells you that you are functionally part of their jurisdiction, go home and read your deed. Walk your boundary with a recorded survey in your hand, and find your corners with your own 2 feet. Keep a folder. Date everything, the day, the time, what was said, what was done, and file it, whether anything ever comes of it or not, because the day it matters, you will not have time to start. Make a public records request for the chain of title on the ground around you, because the answer is sitting at the county courthouse, waiting for anyone patient enough to ask. The people who overreach almost never check the paper. The paper is how you win, and you win it quietly, years before they know they have lost. If you have got a story of your own, an HOA, a code office, a clipboard that forgot to check the deed, put it in the comments. Subscribe if you want to ride along, because there are more of these than you would believe. Next time, I'm going to tell you about a man who got fined for the color of his barn by an HOA that did not know his grandfather's water rights ran under their entire golf course. Until then, walk your lines and keep your folder.